So it was around just after, I think, the July 4th holiday, I read an article, and it was an opinion article in Scientific American, and it was written by Allison Hopper, and she's a filmmaker, a designer. I believe she has a master's degree in educational design from New York University. And what raised sort of my focus towards this article and why I shared it with everyone here was the title of the piece is what caught my attention. And it was this stated, quote, "Denial of evolution is a form of white supremacy." And then going on in the sub portion, she says, "As museums reopen, let's introduce ourselves and our children to the original Black ancestors of all human beings," end quote. And so I shared the article with you guys, and part of, I think, what we wanted to do was, put our arms around other people, and even the author, Allison Hopper, and say, let's seek the truth together. Let's do that in gentleness, respect. But at the same time, if there's areas of contention, places that we disagree, that we would, talk about those things. And I think there were some certain areas of disagreement that we had. And so one of the things that jumped out at me, and it's actually not a criticism, it's actually something I think that we can affirm. One of Hopper's stated main goals in the article is one that I think we can affirm, and her aim is this, and I quote, "to get science into the classroom and into our culture at large," end quote. And I mean, broadly speaking, I think that's something we can affirm. I mean, this is something as a science and faith organization, we can affirm this. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Hugh, and maybe Jeff as well?
Sure. Well, it was a shock to me as a Canadian coming to the United States and discovering how little science the general public here in America knew. I mean, I was taught the scientific method in grade 1. We got it all 12 years. You were not allowed just to take one science class to get out of high school. You had to take multiple science classes. And as we understand science, it's the book of nature. And just taking one science class doesn't do justice to what we should know about the book of nature. I think that's a hallmark of reasons to believe, is that we're integrating across the scientific disciplines and looking for answers in the book of nature that are consistent. But how can you do that if all you looked at is, say, one class in science in a specialized area, or you haven't had a deep training in how to engage in the scientific method and put everything to the test?
And Jeff, you have told me, and I think you've been a part of here at Reasons, about mentoring people, other students, getting people into the STEM fields. How do you feel about that idea of getting science into the classroom?
I think it's just a phenomenal idea. I mean, I've encouraged my kids, whether they're going into science disciplines or not, to take science classes, because science, when it's done well, it teaches you how to think well. Because it seems like we're kind of in this era where if I feel it, it's got to be right. And what I love about science is that there is a standard by which you measure your ideas. So I can have all sorts of ideas about how things might work, but I need to go out and check and see, do they actually work in the real world? Does the real world validate them? And so there is this pursuit of truth, and I think science is a great tool to do that. So the more we get people engaged in understanding what science has to say, I think that goes a long way towards bad thinking, or clearing up bad thinking and clearing up misconceptions, so that we can actually make good decisions based on what the real world has to say.
George, if I just may throw in my 2 cents, and this would be another point where I think we could strongly find points of common ground with Allison Hopper beyond this desire to see science, broadly communicated and understood by the general public. And that's this idea that we are, staunchly opposed to racial discrimination, as I think individuals and as an organization. I think diversity is a hallmark of the team here at Reasons to Believe. And so we would, share with Allison Hopper the deep concern that there is racial division within, the United States, within the world, and that, the discoveries of anthropology are really provocative in that the oldest people groups, are African people groups. And that means that the first humans likely looked like African people groups, and that, anthropology has learned, molecular anthropology specifically, that we are really all Africans underneath our skin, that the regional differences or the racial differences among us are really superficial. And so this is something that we would strongly affirm at Reasons to Believe. And I think that idea that the very first humans likely, again, looked like African people groups, and that, again, we all have our ancestry recently in what, again, appear to be dark-skinned people, is, a scientific point that I don't think is really broadly communicated. And so I agree with Allison Hopper. It's a shame that you go to a natural history museum and you don't see the human origin displays properly communicating that fact. So that's something that we would strongly affirm. And she's right to point out that problem. And she's right to point out that insight, I think, helps promote really a sense of unity among human beings, not a sense of division.
That's something we can affirm. One of the things that she states is, she says specifically, and I wrote it down so I don't misquote her, well, we can agree and acknowledge that the Christian church has made, as you, Buzz, have pointed out, some mistakes in justifying and supporting racism. But she says that one of the major roadblocks to getting science in the classroom is Christianity and Christianity's ties to allegedly racism and white supremacy in its denial of evolution. What do we want to say about that making that connection and that being an obstacle?
Yeah, George, I think that it's true that there have been people who have looked at Scripture and maybe utilized scriptural teaching for their own selfish ends. Remember, the Bible says people are fallen, they're broken. That's the way people act. But I don't think that that's the clear picture. It's not the full picture, because the full picture has to be appreciated that the greatest opponents to slavery and therefore wanting Black people to have full equal rights were people who saw the biblical teaching of people are made in the image of God. And because they're made in the image of God, they have dignity and they have value. So if you're going to get rid of creation, you're likely going to get rid of the best argument used to prohibit slavery. I think that's lost on Hopper.
Another thing I think is lost is Christianity is no longer a white man's religion. We are in the minority. And so, just let's look at the facts, and it's becoming more so. I think we're going to be increasingly becoming more and more of a minority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an important point, Hugh, because I've done some back of the envelope calculations, and I bet most people, most of the 2.3 billion people of the world who identify as Christians are probably technically non-white, and creation.
By a wide margin.
Yeah, and creation is an integral idea to Christianity, and the idea that humans bear God's image. To your point, Ken. So, it's absurd to think that there's an element of white supremacy within Christianity in light of that statistic.
Yeah, and Jeff, you had made the point as well, I think in the communication to me, that Christianity at its core is opposed to racism and white supremacy, that the worldview, you can't connect it up with that. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I found that was one of the things that I found kind of frustrating and discouraging about Allison Hopper's article, is she made this claim that creationism is at its core white supremacy, just for a couple of reasons. One is that it points out that Christians have used the Bible to promulgate racism in the past. And, it's something that as Christians, I think we need to own up to, that this has been used in the past. But I think deeper in that is that there's this idea that somehow Christianity is inherently racist. That, if I remember correctly, she made some sort of claim that there's this unbroken chain of white people. Adam and Eve were white, and it's been propagated till today. And it's like that's just untenable. I mean, you've got Jesus actually came to the Middle East. There's nothing white about the Middle East, and the much darker skin. In its core, Christianity eliminates all of those distinctions. I mean, you've got Peter, where in Christianity, Judaism has a strong connection in history in Christianity, where Peter was unwilling to go out and talk to non-Jews because they weren't the right people, if you will. And God very clearly says, no, that's not the right way to look at it. Everybody can be part of my family. And, Paul reiterates that, talking about the people in the kingdom, there's neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave, nor free, nor woman, nor man. It's like, we are all children of God. So at its fundamental core, Christianity is entirely opposed to racism, because every single person bears the image of God, and every single person has just as much value because of that image. So there's no greater or less than. And so, I think that there's a part where it speaks to Christians that we need to be better at communicating that. But there's no aspect to where, well, okay, you can be a Christian and you kind of have to work at racism. At its core, Christianity wants to eliminate racism because it's not a distinction worth talking about, because we're all valuable in God's sight.
Yeah, in the article, she states specifically, Hopper states that she wants to, quote, wants to unmask the lie that evolution denial is about religion and recognize that at its core, it is a form of white supremacy that perpetrates segregation and violence against Black bodies. So there, from her words, that it's at its core, there's a connection to that. Can you talk, you mentioned that a little bit, Ken,
yeah.
But is that really at the core of Christianity?
Yeah, I think I found that quote the most disturbing in the article. And I would speak to it from being a logic instructor. I've always taught my students that if you're going to critique somebody else, you're generous to them, and you take their strongest, most robust point of view. I also think that you recognize that am I being fair? Am I being careful? What troubles me about this quote is she says wants to unmask the lie that evolution denial is about religion, and recognize that its core, it's a form of white supremacy. Well, I'm in opposition to naturalistic evolution. But it's not because of racism. It's because I think it's a poor explanatory theory. I think most Christian people who critique evolution, they think it's about worldview ideas. They think about, does this comport well with science? So for me, it's reason and logic and rationality. I might also say that, I don't want to presuppose that other people are the worst they can be. I mean, when I talk with evolutionists who disagree with me, I try to take into account their worldview. I try to have a meeting of the minds, but she doesn't give a lot of charity here. She seems to read it in the worst light possible, and to me, that's very concerning.
There's a really good, to be, charitable to Allison Hopper, there is an article that she cites. It's a very nice piece written, or at least published by the National Center of Science Education in the early 2000s, where they were exploring the relationship between creationism, racism, and evolution. And so they do cite the fact that there was this slavery apologetics that goes back into the Civil War, where people were trying to justify the institution of slavery using scripture as their moral authority, and developing interpretations of the early chapters of Genesis that supposedly supported, again, the slavery institution. The Southern Baptist denomination was formed as a pro-slavery, denomination. Or you have, after the emancipation, these ideas persisted, particularly among Southern fundamentalists and evangelicals about the inferiority of African Americans. Those groups also happen to be, creationists, and also happen to be those who would denounce the teaching of evolution. So there is this association, but it's just because there's an association doesn't mean there's a cause and effect relationship. There's a connection, but it's not necessarily a cause and effect relationship.
And I wonder, I'm sorry, Hugh, go ahead.
Oh, because you and I were at the Museum of the Bible, where they had this great exhibit on slavery and the Bible, and these people you cite that were trying to use the Bible to support slavery. Their tactic was to take passages out of the Bible. Mm-hmm. The abolitionist says, no, we need to read the entire Bible, and so they actually were encouraging people, look at what all Scripture says, kind of what we're saying about science. Look what all the scientific disciplines are saying. But I was shocked to discover how much of the Bible the pro-slavery people basically took out of the Bible. It was an edited Bible.
And I'm willing to admit that there have been, times in church history in which people have misused the biblical text. But I think it's important to recognize how critically important the Imago Dei is. I mean, it is the foundation for the sanctity of human life. And it's also, I think, important to appreciate that Darwin had some very critical comments, basically stating that blacks were inferior to whites. And what is not mentioned is eugenics, where after this evolutionary theory becomes very widespread, there are people who think, well, if you're not a perfect human being, we may just eliminate you. So I'm willing to accept that Christians make fundamental mistakes, but so do naturalists.
If I can say something to that, Ken, I think that's a pretty powerful point that often gets missed, is that there are Christians who have used the Bible to justify slavery, but in doing so, you're going against the flow of what Christianity has to say. And so you're right. Christians have used it wrongly and to great consequence, to bad consequence. But it's going against the flow of what Scripture and what the Christian worldview has to say. Whereas I don't know that I can make that claim in a naturalistic worldview. You can say that everybody has value in a naturalistic worldview, but that seems to be going against the flow if evolution is the explanation for things. So to me, if you want a worldview that says, hey, racism is wrong and everybody's a value, Christianity is the worldview you want there. That's the one where you're going with the flow, with the emphasis to get it to work.
I've gone back and I've reread parts of The Descent of Man, and it's actually horrifying because, now, in Darwin's day, there were two views for the origin of humanity. One was called monogenesis and one was called polygenesis. We'll just put polygenesis on hold. Darwin held to monogenesis, which meant there was a single origin for humanity, and all the different racial groups came from a singular origin. But Darwin saw these different groups as being in different stages of evolution. And he saw non-white groups as being savages. He uses this term over and over and over again in multiple books. And that's a pejorative term, where he saw non-white people as being inferior intellectually, morally incapable of living, righteous lives, if you will. He saw them lacking self-command. And in fact, Darwin, again, viewed the different racial groups as evidence for natural selection at work. And applying natural selection, he even argues in The Descent of Man for British imperialism, because the white Europeans were clearly superior and, according to the tenets of natural selection, had every right to use their fitness, their greater fitness to essentially suppress other groups. Interestingly enough, Darwin was also an abolitionist at the same time. And so it just goes to show you that white supremacy was the issue. And I imagine his abolitionism was parental in nature. But you move beyond Darwin, and you're mentioning Francis Galton and eugenics and social Darwinism. This all flows out of Darwin's ideas. But you move into anthropology in the early 1900s, it's horrific in terms of the racism. Carlton Kuhn, who promoted this idea of polygenesis or multi-regionalism, where different groups, racial groups, arose independently in different parts of the world and evolved from a primitive form to a modern form. His argument was that these different racial groups had 2 million years of evolutionary mechanisms that shaped them, and that white Europeans, again, were superior, and he even ranked the different racial groups according to skin color and according to what he saw to be, superiority to inferiority, and that this reflected different stages of evolution. So these ideas were very much part of evolutionary anthropology that go back to Darwin, but that legacy persisted well into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so, the issue is white supremacy, where people use their source of authority to make their case for white supremacy, whether it's scripture or whether it is science, regardless of what either actually truly says.
It'd just be nice if some of that came out in the article, a balanced perspective.
So would this be a fair summary that, to Jeff's point and Ken's and what you're saying, is that there's resources within the authoritative text in Christianity that would help us go against racism and white supremacy, and also resources in the Christian scriptures that would show the dignity of human beings. Yet, if I heard you correctly, Fuzz, in the development of Darwinism, social Darwinism, there aren't necessarily those resources to overturn those views. In fact, they might actually, would you say, lead to, flow causally from them?
I think that would be a fair statement in the early days of evolutionary anthropology. But this is really, to be fair, to our friends who are evolutionary biologists and who work in the question of human origins. Most people today who are anthropologists would strongly reject the racist and white supremacist history that they have inherited. And part of what is motivating them is the discovery that Allison Hopper is pointing out, is that humanity has a recent origin, and that the very first humans were dark-skinned, and that their genetic variability that you see in African people groups subsumes the genetic variability you see for people outside of Africa, and that the genetics says that the differences between different people groups is really fundamentally, in a biological sense, highly superficial. It's biologically meaningless for the most part, that we all really have unity. So most anthropologists I know today who are atheists would strongly reject white supremacy and racism for scientific reasons. So this is really Allison Hopper's point, I think, in the piece, is that this discovery really should have broad societal implications in terms of how we think about one another.
Ethicists make a distinction between descriptive ethics and prescriptive ethics. So you can describe sort of the scientific description of those persons and that, but to get to a prescription that human beings are valuable in and of themselves, Christians would point to, so would Jews, to the image of God. Help me here, or maybe clarify. It doesn't. I don't know the grounding that they have. Taking that description, how do they get to the ought of, no, we ought to treat people as dignified human beings? I don't see that distinction being made, but I do see it being made in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Or have I heard that wrong?
No, you haven't heard it wrong. Mm-hmm. No, I would fully agree with that point. And this is a point that Jeff made. That is a really good point, is that when you look at the nature of the evolutionary mechanism and you look at human origins in evolutionary terms, there's nothing to suggest that human beings have any greater value or worth than any other creature that has ever lived. There's nothing to suggest that there's ultimate meaning or purpose to our species or to individuals. There's nothing, in fact, evolution is cast in anti-teleological terms, and so that much is true. But I'm just simply saying that, of the evolutionary anthropologists that I read today, almost all of them would reject, white supremacy. And if you ask them why, they would point to the very insight that Allison Hopper is pointing to, that look, we all are the same underneath our skin. It doesn't impart fundamental value to human beings, but it does say that there's no basis for viewing one another as being either inferior or superior, right?
On the other hand, evolutionary principles will lead to racism. I mean, there's going to be an evolution to a particular type. So I think what Jeff was pointing out, there's an inconsistency with the evolutionary worldview and their stance against racism, whereas for Christianity, there is no inconsistency.
I want to point out this and get your guys' response. Hopper makes the claim, and I want to quote her directly so everyone knows we're not building a straw man here or anything. She argues that, quote, "At the heart of white evangelical creationism is the mythology of an unbroken white lineage that stretches back to a light-skinned Adam and Eve. In literal interpretations of the Christian Bible, white skin was created in God's image. Dark skin has a different, more problematic origin," she writes. "As the biblical story goes, the curse or mark of Cain for killing his brother was a darkening of his descendant's skin. Historically, many congregations in the U.S. Pointed to the story of Cain as evidence that black skin was created as a punishment." End of quote. Maybe we can go to the text. It can always be different of how someone uses the text. We've pointed that out. But does the text actually say those things? What comments would you give on her points there?
Yeah, she's reading into the Bible what's not there. There's nothing in the story of Cain that suggests what the mark is or if it had anything to do with the color of his skin.
Is there a tradition that points, that says that?
Well, there is within church history, there are people who have taken that position that the mark of Cain indeed was a skin coloration. But there's nothing in the text to support that.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible is remarkably nonspecific about the physical appearance of Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel and Seth. There's no indication that, the curse of Ham, that's another common argument, that the curse of Ham was dark skinned. There's nothing in the text that would say that either. Again, the text is nonspecific. So any inference about skin color is that just exactly that. It's an inference that's not coming from biblical information.
I think a point that I would make is historical. Remember, Christianity is not merely a Western enterprise. There's an entire branch of Christendom in the East. And when you look at their art, either images of Adam or of Jesus or the Virgin Mary, they reflect a ruddy skin color. And so the idea that this is all kind of interpreted from a Western point of view, Christianity is very, very broad in the way that it approaches these issues.
She mentions, the term evangelical. She says white evangelical. I mean, I was a pastor for over 20 years. Each of you are involved in church, speaking to churches and stuff like that. This isn't something I've heard in a long time in ministry, this sort of unbroken lineage. So I'm not quite sure where she's getting that or what she's pointing to. Certainly, we could point to maybe certain individuals, but that doesn't seem a broad part of the evangelical tradition, as at least I have understood it. Or do you think I'm mistaken there?
No, I don't think you are mistaken. I mean, again, this idea still persists to this day, particularly in the southern part of the United States. I won't go into specifics because it's going to reveal certain people. I would have to be specific about the individuals, so I prefer not to do that. But I do know people that actually still hold this view. I know them personally. So it does exist. But to say that this is mainstream evangelicalism, I think is, again, there's no substantiation for that whatsoever.
Well, I think Ken makes a good point that, these ideas come from the art. And so if you're living in Norway or Sweden, it shouldn't be any big surprise that the artistic renditions of these biblical individuals are white-skinned. On the other hand, if you were to go to India or go to the Middle East, you see a different skin color. So it disturbs me that she's citing certain art as opposed to biblical text. There's nothing in the biblical text that would definitively establish a color. I mean, at best you got an implication that it wasn't white.
Yeah. So then, in sort of wrapping at least some of it up, let's go after just a few key points there. She tries to tie an affirmation of evangelical theology or whatever to racism, white supremacy, and the fact that the denial of evolution is there. Hugh, are there scientific reasons that we point to that help us, that make us skeptical about evolution?
What struck me about the piece, the irony is that she printed this at the very time when we're seeing articles in the scientific literature written by scientists who are not theists saying we can't make this naturalistic evolutionary model work. I remember writing a piece about a number of scientists uncovering the fact when we see mass speciation events, the phyla show up first, not the species or the genera. The phyla and the classes show up first, and the phyla show up more suddenly rather than gradually. This is the opposite of what a naturalistic model would predict. And we're talking earlier the significance of integrating the sciences. As an astrophysicist, I can't integrate the physics of the sun, the changing physics of the sun, with the changing biology of life on Earth from a naturalistic perspective. I made the point that it takes a mind that knows the future physics of the sun to make sure you got the right life on planet Earth at the right time to perfectly compensate for the brightening of the sun. So as I speak to evolutionary biologists, I engage them with physics and astronomy. Because hey, this is something that's important. A lot of people in evolutionary biology think all I need to look at is genetics, all I need to look at is paleontology, the rest of science doesn't matter. That's simply not correct.
Are there so the denial of certain interpretations of evolution are not connected to white supremacy or racism? We want to flatly out deny that. Is there any basis for Alison Hopper's claim that creationism is a form of white supremacy? Jeff, any final responses with that?
I just find out, I would say no. So a qualified no, and this is the qualification, is that people who are Christians who believe in creationism have used the Bible to justify racism. But if you're going to do that, you got to look at the sum totality, and you're hard pressed to get away from one of the main drivers of getting rid of slavery and civil rights movement were Christian religious movements of people who believe in creationism. And so when you look at it as a whole, you find that there are Christians who are creationists who are white supremacists, but that's not the story. That goes against the grain of Christianity. And so let's tell the complete story. Don't hide the warts, but realize the warts are part of a much bigger picture where Christianity really does validate the worth of every human being and wants every human being to flourish and thrive.
I want to add one other thing. I think that when she says that evolution denial is not about religion, rather it's about a power play, I think she's reading there through a very postmodern prism. You really can't know the truth. You can't have absolutes. She seems to depart from reason and rationality and say, if you're denying this, it's because you've got an ulterior motive. That troubles me. I think you have to be very careful about judging the motives of others. I mean, I might be wrong about my views of creation, and naturalistic evolution may be true, but I can tell you straight out, I'm looking for the truth. And I think you want to extend that charity to other people.
Another place I think we might be able to agree with her is her reaction to creationism. I'm reluctant to take on the title of creationist because I know how people interpret that. I'm saying that's not me. I'm not anti-science. I don't believe that the universe is only 6,000 years old and all the other baggage that comes with that. So I think we need to appeal and say there are different branches of creationism. And yes, there's some branches of creationism that we here would find quite offensive theologically and scientifically. And therefore we would have compassion for reaction against that brand of creationism. But I wonder, Has she even been exposed to our brand of creationism?
And how would you explain that? How would you articulate that? I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but she says, what is your view? What would you say briefly?
Well, there's a common quote out there that I'm sure she's aware of, that, intelligent design is creationism in a cheap tuxedo. And basically they're conflating all beliefs in creation with young earth creationism, and not realizing that, I would say even the majority of Christians who have doctoral degrees in theology and in science do not fall into that camp. So like she's lumping everybody into the most extreme camp. You said it earlier, Ken, is that you don't want to critique people who disagree with you by looking at the worst possible interpretation you can put on their view.
Jesus had views in the Sermon on the Mount. What is a good person? But more importantly, how do we make good people? Is Christianity basically bad, or is it basically good? In this research, what would you communicate?
Yeah, well, I liked your earlier point that, worldviews have to be coherent. And within the biblical perspective, we're to treat our neighbor as ourselves. We're to love other people, to care for them. Why? Because of this big picture theological view of creation. They're made in the image of God. If you discriminate against people of a different color, that's an offense not only to that person, but to God himself. So I think it's clear that the Imago Dei is so important because it lays a foundation for dignity and value. But you're right. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about loving your neighbor. He talks about caring for people. And then in the Old Testament, I'm old enough to remember Martin Luther King preaching. And even as a young person, I noticed how often he would quote the Old Testament, that Yahweh cares about orphans and widows and the immigrant at the gate, that God has a heart for people who maybe don't have a lot of power, or a person who suffers. And so when I read the Old Testament and the New Testament, I see a great presentation of human beings are made in the image of God and have value, and God's going to judge me based upon my love of my neighbor.
Yeah, you see that in the Old Testament. There was always an avenue for someone who was not Jew to become a Jew. Many Egyptians came with the Jews in the Exodus. They were probably in the majority. In the New Testament, Paul talks about the mystery of the gospel, God making two people that are divided, one, Jews and Gentiles together. And that same Apostle Paul in Galatians that Jeff quoted, there is no difference between man and woman, slave and free, Greek and Jew, we're all one.
That's a revolutionary statement.
Yeah.
Well, to me, I think what maybe makes me sad about this article that was written was here was a wonderful opportunity to actually build bridges, to identify a place of common ground, where the article could have been written in such a way that, look, here's this insight, that we have from anthropology that really challenges white supremacy. And interestingly enough, the most prominent creationist organizations hold views that align with this scientific discovery, and that this is a place where we can all come together and unite as human beings with different worldviews and different priorities, but have the overarching idea that together we can work to make white supremacy, white superiority, racial discrimination, however you want to term it, something that becomes less and less of a factor in our world today. That to me is the sad thing, is that this particular piece, divides as opposed to actually seeks to unify. And I think in the long run, by villainizing people that really should be your allies, you have created, again, another rip in our culture, another rip in our society that doesn't need to be there.
What would we encourage people to do in light of this? We want to build bridges. We don't want to build, straw men, straw persons, and we want to represent their views fairly, but also expose error where we think there's error, but then to promote truth and gentleness and respect. What would we want to encourage You have all published, you've written books. How do we respond to something like this in gentleness and respect? What would we ask people to do?
I think you summarized it pretty well there, frankly. One thing that I really appreciate about Reasons to Believe is every scholar on the team and the staff as well, all of us are committed to what I would call the golden rule of apologetics. And that is, we try to treat other people's beliefs the way we want ours treated. Doesn't mean we accept their views, but it means we use deference. It means that we're fair-minded. We try to get their perspective correctly. And, I hope Scientific American might consider letting another person respond to this article. I mean, science really is about looking at the different views. I would like to say, why don't you have a thoughtful creationist respond?
I think that's a good point, Ken. And, it's like, how can we open a dialogue, particularly in this area? But, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot lately is, there's a lot of disagreement, but, is there a way we can ask the question, what worldview actually helps us solve the problem we're trying to? I mean, if we're wanting to get rid of racism and white supremacy and anything that says, oh, this person's better because of their color of their skin, or this person's worse because of their color of their skin, which worldview actually helps us do that? And how do we have a robust discussion that allows us to get down to that? I think if we can dialogue about that, that may go a long way towards building some bridges and helping people relate to each other better.
Just learning a little bit more about what God has revealed to us. He's given us a book of scripture. He's given us a book of nature. For people who disagree with me, I just like to encourage you, you need to look at this stuff. Don't just look at one scientific discipline and see what happens. I think God gave us these tools in order to resolve these issues that divide us.
In Jesus, we have God taking on the form of a human being and living among us and dying for our sake and revealing to us what is the true image of God, and giving us a means by which that image of God that's in us that is tarnished can actually be fully recovered. And it's through that process that you begin to see the image of God in every other human being and how valuable it is, because God took on a human form so that those people could be reconciled to him as well. That, to me, is an incredibly powerful message that I think is really lost, in these types of, sadly, in these types of pieces.
And what buttresses your point, Fuzz, is that in the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul talks about the image of God, he doesn't point to Adam, he points to Christ.